Hello, everyone, and welcome to the lecture for week 8, where we are going to be discussing providing feedback to your clients and sharing assessment reports. This is also going to be our last lecture as our course is coming to an end. So, this lecture is actually going to be a little bit shorter just because I know you've got a lot on your plates with the final week of our course together. So let's jump in and talk a little bit about what it means to provide assessment feedback and to conduct an assessment feedback session. So typically, an assessment feedback session is the first opportunity that you have to share with your client the assessment findings that you gathered through your time working with this client. Assessment feedback sessions are done in real time. So you're doing this in a way where the client gets to share their reactions, their questions, and their proposed alterations to the assessment report, depending on the agency, and we'll get into a little bit more detail on that. But the key thing here is that this is your opportunity to talk in real time with your client about what determinations you have sort of made based on their assessment results, and you get the client's reactions to those things that they like, things that they're struggling with, things that they have questions about, and really how to move forward from there. Depending on the agency, these assessment feedback sessions can be done virtually or in person. It really depends on the agency, but virtual options tend to be a little bit more accessible for clients and a little bit nicer because assessment feedback sessions aren't as long as traditional testing sessions or even the intake report or the intake session. So it's nice to have a virtual option so that clients who are traveling from greater than 20 or 30 minutes don't have to drive further or spend more time in the car than they will in the room with you. Typically, an assessment feedback session occurs about 2 weeks after the last day of data collection. So, you schedule your feedback session on the day that you do testing so that you and the client already know going in that there is an end date to the work that you're doing together. An end date is in quotes here because there are ways that you sometimes are still involved in the client's life even after the assessment feedback session has been completed. But you're typically doing this in a timely manner. If you wait longer than 2 weeks, you're really dragging out the assessment not only for yourself, but also for the client. They're waiting for those results because they don't get them until they meet with you. And the longer you wait to conduct that feedback session, the harder it is for you to recall all of the information that is unique to that client and isn't necessarily getting mixed in with other assessments that you're doing or even other counseling clients that you have. And as I've already briefly mentioned, the session length of a feedback session is going to vary widely based on quite a few different factors. Number one, the depth of your assessment. If you're doing more testing, your feedback session is going to be longer. If you have to go over more test results and more functional impact statements, that takes more time. You're also going to have a longer feedback session if you have really complex findings for your client. If you have findings that don't always make sense or maybe contradict one another, you need to make sure that you are conveying that in a way that makes sense to the client and so that it is written out in a way that even when the client is no longer in the room with you, when they are 2, 5, 10 years down the road, they know what you were saying. They understand what their results are still, even though they haven't heard from you in years. And also, session length is going to vary if your client asks a lot of questions. Some clients are just like, yep, cool, I hear you. All right, I'm good, I don't have any questions. And your feedback session could be 15 minutes. Sometimes you have clients who are a little bit more talkative, want to sit and process the results, have a lot of questions moving forward, and those sessions can get upwards of an hour and a half long. It really varies by so many different factors, and your agency or wherever you're working might have sort of a template that they want you to follow, or even just like a general timeline that they want you to follow in terms of how long the session will be. but again, having a little bit of that flexibility to meet the needs of the client. Oftentimes, as well, I think it's important to mention that these feedback sessions count as direct face to face hours with your client. Even though you're going over assessment results, where like scoring and report writing are typically indirect, these feedback sessions are direct face to face hours on your licensures. Also, within these assessment feedback sessions, some agencies will require you to have your assessment report written before your feedback session. This is definitely agency specific, but I will say that it's also a good idea to have your assessment report written before the feedback session, even if it's not required by your agency, for a number of reasons. One, if you have that assessment report written before you meet with the client, it's easier for you to say, okay, here is the report that I have. And you can give a copy of it to the client in the room and say, we're going to go over this together. We're going to go over what all the content is in this report so that you can ask me questions about what's here. And you can see if the client is struggling with anything that you might need to change the way that things are worded or the order in which results are presented. Whatever it might be, you have more of that option based on your conversation with the client. But also, writing that assessment report before the feedback session also provides you with a template for conducting your feedback session. It gives you exact content that you want to cover with your client, as well as gives you an opportunity to write a very comprehensive assessment report for your client before the information for your client has maybe been influenced by other assessments that you're doing or other clients that you're seeing. It really gives you an opportunity to focus your energy on this client and writing them the most comprehensive report possible. There are also some practical tips to keep in mind when it comes to writing and conducting a feedback session. And one of those is that you, as the clinician, need to identify 2 to 4 main takeaways that you want the client to remember when they leave the room with you. Assessment reports, as you know from the practice assignments that you've been doing, are long documents, and there's a lot of information in there. And it is going to be very easy for clients to get lost in all of the information that is presented. So what you want to do at the beginning of the feedback session, before you ever meet with a client, is identify 2 to 4 main takeaways that you want to reiterate multiple times to the client so that when they leave your office and they go and talk to someone and someone asks like, hey, how did it go? They have those main takeaways that are important for them to remember about themselves. You also want to make sure that you present on both your client's strengths and their growth edges. This tends to be a little bit more of a personal preference than it is a requirement by agencies, so not every clinician does this. And I'm bringing it up to you because it is important to remember that a lot of times assessment reports can be very dense and they can feel a little bit like the client is being reduced to just these numbers or just these things that have been bothering them in the last so many months or years or whatever the timeline is for that client. So it's helpful to provide context to that by focusing on the things that the client is already doing well, as well as the things that they can continue working on in the future to provide them with the most comprehensive picture of their assessment moving forward and saying like, yeah, I learned a lot about myself in multiple areas. You also want to make sure that you check in with the client frequently throughout your feedback sessions. You're looking to make sure, one, that they understand what you're saying about the assessment results, but you also want to check in for their reactions. Say, okay, I wanted to check in. What are your reactions to that part that I just covered? Or I know this might not be the result that you were expecting. What are your reactions? What are you feeling? What are you thinking right now? Really take time to check in and make sure that you're monitoring what the client is experiencing in the room with you or in the virtual room with you regarding this assessment about them. And also, potentially be amenable to some changes to the assessment report. You might sit in the room with a client and realize that something was worded in a way that might be confusing for your client. Your client might even tell you that when you're asking them for their reactions or their understanding of what you just said. They might be like, yeah, that really doesn't make sense the way that you have it written. But when you say it out loud, it makes sense. If a client says something like that, consider the option of maybe changing the way that you have worded that particular line in that client's assessment report, because they're going to be the ones that need this report moving forward. It is a part of their lives, so you want to write the report in a way that makes sense for them. And finally, you also want to make sure that you provide the client with ways that they can reach out to you should they have any questions about the assessment experience or the assessment results after they have ended their time with you. Feedback session is done, you have no future sessions scheduled with this client. They still need to be able to get in contact with you should they have questions. A good thing, or a good protocol that I use with clients is letting them know, hey, you can always reach out to me via email if something happens and you just have questions. I'm happy to converse with you over email. Here's my work phone number as well if you can't get a hold of me via email or if you prefer to talk on the phone. And then I also offer to them, if needed, if you're realizing 2 months down the road from now that you have a lot of questions and it might be hard to have an email conversation about it, we can schedule another feedback session. We can answer those questions again. I'm happy to be accessible to you should those questions come up. So you're going to find a method that works the best for you, and you might find that other people use different methods. It's really finding your sort of perspective on being available to clients and really making sure that they understand the report that's written for them. So you're going to see on Canvas that there is a sample feedback session that you can watch for our mock client, Alex. So make sure that you are checking that out and watching it to get an example of what a feedback session might look like. This is an example of a much shorter feedback session, and part of that is because it was a simple mock client. So we really can't talk about feedback sessions without really conversing about what you should do if your client disagrees with you during the feedback session. Because clients can disagree with you for a number of reasons. They might be in a space that you weren't expecting going into the feedback session, and that can change the way that they interpret the results. I will say that a good majority of clients are going to agree with the diagnoses that you render. Because oftentimes when you're going into a feedback session and you're presenting your results to the client, you are putting words to experiences that the client has been having for a while. But sometimes clients don't agree with you, and you really have to navigate that in the feedback session while also recognizing that that disagreement is normal. So, some of the reasons why clients might disagree with you are if you're rendering a stigmatized diagnosis. They can also maybe disagree if the diagnosis rendered will carry significant repercussions in the client's life. They can also disagree if you did not find support for a diagnosis that they might have been expecting. Or they can disagree for a number of personal reasons that are unknown to you as the clinician. And all of these things are normal reactions and can happen at various points in our assessment experience as clinicians. So, when that disagreement occurs, it's really important for you to validate the client's symptoms and to provide the client with a context for the outcome of the assessment. So, a really good example of this is taking the client's symptoms and putting them in context. So, if a client comes in and says, I was expecting this diagnosis and you didn't render it, but I'm still struggling with these symptoms that are consistent with this diagnosis, using that, validating, yes, I hear you and you absolutely are experiencing these difficulties, and here's how I see them showing up in your life. Here's where they seem to make sense given all of the pieces that I have seen and all of the things that you have shared with me. Providing that context to help the client see these things, these symptoms, these presenting concerns that you're having are so vast and will cover so many different things, and the sources of them will change. So it isn't a one size fits all with diagnosis. And keeping that in mind when you're talking to your client. You're also going to need to remember that assessment scores support diagnosis. They do not solely determine diagnosis. So, this is particularly important with feedback sessions when assessment results contradict one another. In regards to maybe you have one report that has support for a diagnosis and you have one report that does not support a diagnosis. Remembering that each of these are one component of what is needed to render a diagnosis for a client, and using that as context for the way that you talk with the client about the assessment results that you have presented, even if they are disagreeing with them. Reminding yourself and reminding the client that there is more to diagnosis than just the scores on the report. And seek supervision and consultation as much as you need, both before and after your feedback session has occurred. And I say before because sometimes you might know going in that a client might be a little bit hesitant with the results that you're presenting. They might not be very happy with it for one reason or another. You might have an inkling of that. And if that happens, seek consultation, seek supervision, get some support, and have a little bit of a plan going into feedback that allows you to really set up a plan of how to address this disagreement with the client. And even after the feedback session has occurred, check in with your supervisor, check in with your colleagues, see if there's something that you can learn from that, see if there's something that you can do differently in the future, even with that client again, if necessary. So after you've conducted a feedback session, the next component is sharing the assessment report with the client. And the number one important thing about report sharing is that reports need to be completed and shared within a reasonable amount of time. And this is number one, followed very quickly by HIPAA requirements, if not exactly tied, because you need to, as a clinician, share a report within as little amount of time as possible for your client, because these reports tend to be used by the client for really important decisions in their lives. The longer you drag out a report, the harder it is to write the report, and the harder it is for the client to get the support that they're needing or to get the outcomes that they're needing based on your report. So, timing of your report sharing is so important. In fact, it is so problematic if you have to delay sharing a report because you're falling behind, because it then creates a chain in all of your reports, all of your assessments, that you start to fall behind. So make sure that you're paying attention to that when you are talking about with your client when they should expect their report to be in. As I mentioned, the other number one most important thing with report sharing is that these are medical documents. Assessment reports are documents that go into your client's medical file. So these documents need to be written in that way, and they need to be shared in that way, protected by HIPAA and shared in a way that is going to protect the privacy of your client. So agencies are going to have determinations that will set up what delivery method you're going to use, and clients also have a say. So some clients say, like, I need you to physically hand me the report when it's done. Other agencies and clients might say, nope, email is best, or maybe they need it mailed to them. Whatever it is, you're going to have to sort of flex to whatever the agency policies are, as well as the client's preferences. But regardless of which method you choose, there are some things to keep in mind. If you're sending a report by mail, consider sending the report as a certified letter. A certified letter provides you with a receipt that someone has received the letter that you have sent. And when you send a letter that is certified, you get a tracking number so you can track where the letter is at any given time. which helps you to make sure that the client is the person receiving the letter. Typically, you cannot verify that the client is the person receiving the letter, but a certified mail receipt does help with that. If you are sending a report by email, it is good practice to encrypt the email so that the individual who is receiving the email or receiving the report via email is the person that they say they are. But it is always important to send the report as a PDF instead of a Word document, a text file, a Google document, whatever form of writing you use. When you send the report to the client, you must always send it as a PDF, because if you send the document as a Word, text, or doc, it can be edited by the client. If you send it as a PDF, it cannot be edited. So make sure that you are always sending that report as a PDF. And it's always good practice to verify delivery with your client, and that comes in whatever form makes the most sense for you and for the client. That can be turning on read receipts in emails, but it can also be setting up a confirmation phone call with your client, just saying like, hey, wanted to check in, looks like it was supposed to arrive by email or by mail. Did you get the report? Making sure that they've got it. So you've conducted your feedback session, you've shared the report with your client. What happens next? What do you do next with the work that you've done with this client? Well, depending on the agency that you work for, you may have an obligation to advocate for your client in various settings. So this can look like going to legal proceedings to present on your assessment results. This can also be explaining the results of your assessment to important members of the client's life. That can be their work, their employers, medical providers, school district, depending on the age of your client, anything like that. You might have an obligation, depending on your agency, to go to these events and to advocate for your client. Explain what the results are in context for the client and to support the client in explaining those results themselves if necessary. It is kind of interesting when assessment agencies do allow this amount of advocacy, because it isn't always what we think of automatically with assessments. But you are the person who created this assessment report, and sometimes you are necessary to be able to explain it in a way that is reputable for the client. So in high stakes testing situations where the assessment result is going to be determining a really important finding for your client. And all of this advocacy work tends to count as face-to-face direct hours on your LPC. So keep that in mind, that even if you have finished your assessment testing and you've done your feedback report, anytime that you are presenting on the findings in advocacy for your client counts as a direct hour. So that leads us into your final assignment for this class, which is the final integrated assessment report that will be due at 11:59 p.m. on Sunday of week 8. So within this final integrated report, you are going to be completing the very last assignment for this course, because we're right here at the end. But this particular report is going to be a combination of the 3 previous drafts of the assessment report in one comprehensive document. So you are going to take all 3 previous assignments, make sure that they're all in one document, and that is going to be what you're going to submit, in addition to a couple of other things. So primarily, you're going to be graded on 3 components of your report. The first of those is the ability to implement the feedback that was provided to you on previous drafts. So this is going to be taking the feedback that you received on the assignment that you submitted for week 5, 6, and 7, and making sure that you are implementing and expanding upon it in any way that was necessary. That is going to be worth 12 points on this final integrated report. The second component that you will be graded on is your ability to include all of the required components of the document. In the final integrated assessment report, that includes the demographic information that appears in the table on the very first page, the reason for referral, your assessment procedures, the background history sections, assessment and testing results, functional impact and summary, recommendations and referrals, and then Appendix A, which is your scores table. That component of this assignment is worth 12 points as well. And the third component on which you will be graded is your overall writing quality, which is going to include things like using complete sentences, having proper grammar, proofreading your document, making sure that your document flows well, is easy to read, and is free of spelling errors. And this component is worth 6 points in the final assignment, bringing our total out to 30 points on this assignment. And as I already mentioned, this assignment is due at 11:59 p.m. on Sunday of week 8. And please reach out if you have questions about how to best implement the feedback that you received on those previous drafts. And keep in mind as well that late submissions on this assignment will only be accepted on a case-by-case basis with approval from me as the instructor. And I want to wrap up by just saying that I have really enjoyed having all of you in class over the last 8 weeks. And you did some amazing work in this class. I know it was fast, and I know you have so many things that are pulling you in so many different directions. And I appreciate you taking the time to be a part of this class for the last 8 weeks. So I wish you the absolute best in your next stages, and take care.